and thank you so much for everyone for attending. Um, yeah, I think Nathan is going to show briefly the introduction of this. Nathan, I don't know if you can just share screen yet. So this is the introduction of the project, which we'll just take you through, and then we'll come on to what we're going to do over the next hour. But as you can see, it's a visual reconstruction. AI recommended blowing up this building, civilians died. And then artificial intelligence is rapidly reshaping warfare from data collection and processing to target selection. New technologies are hastening how militaries kill. And then this project visualizes how AI is transforming every aspect of war, breaking down how militaries are offloading life and death decisions to flawed technologies. And then you have the title card. Yeah, and so just to start off here, the five of us on this call are the five authors. I'm moderating, so I'm just going to be very brief. This is obviously slightly unusual talk in the sense of some of you might have read the piece, many of you will not. So we're going to try and do quite a lot in just under an hour. And essentially, I will start by briefly trying to explain what we were trying to do with the project. Then Sophia and Heidi, as the kind of technical experts, will explain how they framed the intellectual challenge of marrying military tech, underlying AI systems and military practice. And then Namir and Nathan will talk you through the challenge of turning that intellectual framework into a visual project. And then finally, we're going to show just one chapter of the 6 chapters and talk about how we bring together those different elements into a single, hopefully narrative and clear visual product. Just a quick bit of housekeeping in terms of comments. There's a Q&A function. So if you want to, feel free to put questions from now. What would be really useful is if you could say who the question is for. And then we'll come to those. We should have 10-15 minutes at the end to get to some questions. Briefly, then I'll start with my bit, which is, my name's Joe. I'm the director of programs at Airwars. I was formerly a kind of Middle East correspondent based in the Middle East for 10 years, mostly with AFP, Agence France Presse. I'm also the co-founder of a thing called the open source munitions portal, which specializes in kind of munitions analysis. For those of you not familiar with the organization, Airwars is a global civilian harm watchdog that uses visual journalism to tell in narratives around civilian harm in conflict. AI Now is an institute providing expert and critical analysis of AI in many different areas, including warfare. Heidi and myself have been talking for nearly 2 years about what was missing in the conversation around military AI, and both Airwars and AI Now regularly get media requests, journalist requests, NGO requests, United Nations requests, these kind of things about understanding AI in conflict. And I think both of us, we were all cognizant of the fact that like what often happens is that people jump to essentially a version of warfare that doesn't yet widely reflect reality. The widespread use of fully autonomous weapons, what you would think of as more traditionally the science fiction, the realm of science fiction. They also include, lots of upselling from both companies and militaries about the capabilities and what their capabilities can do. But the reality is like a lot more complicated. And I think what we say, and we think I'll read directly from the first line, is rather than a single overarching program, military AI today consists of overlapping machine learning algorithms rapidly automating tasks previously carried out by humans. In turn, human oversight and accountability is steadily disappearing. And so really what we're trying to get across with this piece is autonomy is not a binary. It's either this is an autonomous weapon or this wasn't. It is a gradient, right? And also the cumulative effect of AI warfare is that warfare is faster and not necessarily any more safe. In fact, could be less safe. And so there's been some incredible reporting from various journalists. I would particularly cite 972, who've done some amazing work on Israel. Katrina Manson at Bloomberg has done an incredible piece of work on Project Maven. But what these journalists tend to focus on is a particular system being used by a particular military at a particular time, which is incredibly important. But what I think we felt was missing was that there was this wider misunderstanding of like how these systems are all similar in different ways, and or the no larger understanding of the common trends between disparate systems, right, across conflicts and where they fit into the military kill chain. And we also felt that like this lack of understanding of exactly what AI warfare is having an impact on, negative impact, including my own lack of understanding at the beginning of this project is having a negative impact on journalism, documentation, accountability. And so what we tried to do was to create a piece that would visually break down into chunks the different bits of AI being used at different parts in the military targeting process. So there is an inevitable simplification to a certain extent, but that's what we've been trying to do. So it's not a specific country or a specific system. The aim is to be accessible to non-specialists like myself, and also serve as a reference going forward. With that, I will hand over to Heidi and Sophia to explain the kind of intellectual framework that they created to make this project work.
Great. Thanks for that, Joe. So my name's Sophia Goodfriend. I'm a researcher at Airwars and also a research fellow at Cambridge. And as Joe mentioned, I'll talk kind of about the overarching idea behind this project and what we're trying to accomplish. As Joe mentioned, the conversation about automated warfare often focuses on, a single weapon system or even one company producing one system, so an Anduril autonomous drone or a Palantir decision support system. And we found this to be kind of inadequate. Part of that came from my own experience. I'm an anthropologist and have spent years researching the impact of automated warfare on the ground in Israel and Palestine. And through my own experience researching these systems and reporting on them and talking to people who use them and talking to people who live with their consequences, it became quite clear that this framing, this focus on one single system, one single company was quite inadequate. So again, rather than kind of focusing on one technology, we wanted to talk about an AI stack, which is to say the set of machine learning algorithms that are threaded through each step of what we're calling and what militaries call today the kill chain. So about a year ago, I showed Joe and Heidi and Namir and Nathan, my colleagues at Airwars, this schema that I had kind of drawn up for an academic talk. And we all thought it was a quite useful framework to build on. We wanted to really create a story about each kind of step in military surveillance and targeting and killing, and really break down how algorithms and machine learning systems are mediating each step of warfare. So we created this. So I brought this schema to them that breaks it into these specific steps, and we kind of built upon that and reframed it, as you'll see in the visual piece. But really, what's important about this is dissecting precisely how AI is integrated at every step. So from the analysis and synthesis of surveillance data to targeting and killing in real time on the battlefield. And really what's important to think about and what's important to note as you kind of go through the piece is the technical limitations and flaws that are built into each machine learning algorithm that's used in each step of this process. So that could be the translation tools that are culling through telecommunications data and analyzing them. It can be the social scoring systems that are recommending people or places to be targeted in an airstrike. So all of these systems have specific technical flaws that we'll be talking through in more detail today. And as they're integrated throughout every step of the kill chain, these flaws pile up. And we're really hoping to kind of emphasize what that means for military targeting, and especially as militaries are rushing to adapt these technologies at really a breakneck speed. So Nathan took this really to the next level, as you'll see going through the website, and making it into a really compelling visual story and visual investigation. And Namir and Joe built it into a really helpful and coherent narrative, and Heidi was essential in kind of dissecting each of the machine learning systems that are threaded through this kill chain. So although it might look complicated here, I think what the final product is quite intuitive and quite useful. So we really wanted to develop this story as a resource and a guide to move beyond really the hype and the mystique that surrounds how these technologies are talked about today. And I think that's what we produced. It gives us really a starting point for dissecting the different algorithms that are embedded in the kill chain and really foreground what's at stake as militaries are relying on these flawed systems to make life and death decisions. So I'll hand it over to Heidi now.
Hi, everyone. It's really great to see so many of you here. I'm Heidi Klaff, the Chief AI Scientist at the AI Now Institute. I'm a safety engineer by training, and I specifically focus on evaluating the safety of AI systems integrating into what we call safety critical systems. So high-stakes systems used in places like defense, nuclear, and aviation, where their failures can lead to physical harm or death. And in sort of navigating this defense space, and also conversations with Sophia and Joe, it seemed clear to me that there's a lack of understanding how faulty AI systems are and their inherent limitations, especially against this backdrop of all these AI providers advertising that they're safe and faster alternatives to existing methods, which doesn't actually hold up if you know a lot about their accuracy rates, reliability, and you've evaluated these models before. So from a technical standpoint, we thought it was really important to demystify the misconceptions about the automated systems being used in the kill chain, where the AI begins, where it ends, and what errors could be attributed to their use, which I think we're seeing kind of be a pretty hot topic at the moment, especially with the war in Iran. Specifically, there's a lot of focus on things like decision support systems like Palantir's Maven or those deployed by the IDF that are seen as sort of a singular AI that makes recommendations based on collected data, when it's really a series of systems and different AI or machine learning algorithms that feed into each other and build on one another. And the issue that these different AI and machine learning algorithms all have their own pitfalls, failure modes, and in general, they have a lack of accuracy across the board. And so when you have a nested use of AI within a larger decision-making system, it ultimately means that you now have compounding errors from both the data and different AI that are then sort of propagating and accumulating through each step of the kill chain. And this actually impairs the ability of any human operators to verify and validate AI-driven recommendations. And because of this, I think the current focus on building oversight mechanisms or meaningful human control, as you often hear sort of in the media, is that it kind of overshadows the fundamental risk of using AI itself, which is that not only do they lack accuracy and reliability as a technology for targeting, but the way they're implemented usually means that interventions aren't always possible. And increasingly, the new AI technologies being used are more opaque, they're black boxes, are even larger in scale than before, that they're more difficult to dissect than, older machine learning technologies. Like, we're seeing this with the use of large language models. So in this piece, we walk through different types of AI that are used in various steps of the military decision making, including large language models. We talk about them, for example, in context of translation munition selection. We also talk about traditional machine learning algorithms that have been used for decades in the military. So things like convolutional neural networks, which are the basis of object recognition. We talk about decision trees and random forests, which are used for risk profiling and link analysis. And, things like recurrent or liquid neural networks, which are used for drone terminal guidance, something we hear a lot about in the wars with Russia and Ukraine. So for each step, we demonstrate how those specific AI or machine learning algorithms are integrated, how they're faulty, and how they can sort of result in deadly consequences for civilians. With that being said, I'll hand it over to Nathan and Namir to sort of give their point of view and how we put this together.
Cool. Thank you, Heidi. So yeah, I'm Nathan Walker. I'm the visual lead at Airwars. So my role is to take our investigative work and find ways that we can tell compelling stories visually. And so for this story, I think what we were really trying to get across was that these are errors that can compound over time throughout the whole kind of kill chain, and they're cascading errors. And we had kind of initially had this thought of telling a story side by side where you see both the civilian perspective and the military perspective at the same time. But what we actually landed on in the end was this setup basically where we've created a replica of what's called a decision support system. And others will go into these in more detail. But basically, we wanted to show how errors can happen by showing the user what the person who is operating these software packages in the military is seeing. So we're giving you, the reader, the amount of information that they have. So as you kind of move through the piece, you can see that you are being shown the same amount of information that they would have. You're seeing the same satellite imagery and things, and you're seeing the same intercepted communications and things like that that they would see. So the idea behind this, and I'm just going to sort of quickly go through the whole piece, but others will dive into it in more detail. But the idea behind it is that we're showing how over time there are several pieces of information that are being shown to the user, and they are all in some way based on some form of autonomous technology, and they are sort of compounding problems over time, and they are essentially making what should be an innocent sort of scenario into something that it's not. And so you kind of go through the piece and you see that they have become so suspicious that they're now using automated drone object recognition technology to have a look at this particular scene. And yeah, we were trying to essentially make a fictionalized story, but give it the appearance of being a real scenario. And so we have these nice sort of 3D visuals of the scene, which were done by Azul de Monte, who is an illustrator who's worked with us quite a lot in the past. And yeah, you can see that we're essentially recreating the entire interface of these systems. And these are based on basically real life demonstrations that are on YouTube freely available of software like Maven Smart System by Palantir and others. So they're based on real screenshots. They're not sort of the product of my imagination or anything. And then we kind of also wanted to have moments where when the strike itself takes place, you are sort of broken out of the operator's perspective. So for most of the piece, you'll be seeing things through the operator's eyes, but then at some point you become sort of, you leave that perspective and you are now as if you are the drone and the strike is taking place while you watch. And there's this kind of element of breaking you out of that sanitized world and being a little bit more like involved in that actual strike happening. And obviously this is a fictional strike, so we had to find a different way to visualize it than you normally would. And then yeah, so after that we just kind of have basically the aftermath as well. And so this we're familiar to a lot of people who have worked in OSINT investigations and things like that, or the kind of human rights NGO space in general, basically the aftermath and the investigations that take place when a strike has been claimed as being righteous, but in fact, Christo, our main character, was not who the military thought he was. He was an innocent civilian the whole time. So those were kind of the main visual elements that we were trying to get across. Basically this idea that you as the user only have access to the information that the system is feeding you. You don't know anything about Christo beforehand. And so I think that makes it compelling when you realize that this has all been a mistake right at this kind of finale point at the end. But yeah, I think that's all from me. And now I will pass over to Namir, who will take it from there.
Thank you, Nathan. And what a wonderful job you've done there with the visual journalism. Hello, everyone. I'm Nuir Shabibi, an independent journalist and research consultant, and I work across surveillance, tech, and national security investigations, and closely with advocates on accountability initiatives. Let me first speak to the development and execution of our storytelling. I'll then zoom in on some important but often overlooked elements of algorithmic warfare, which are messages we aim to communicate in our story. While our story is fundamentally about AI algorithms in warfare, it was necessary to dissect the decision support system into its component parts and constituent data. This was because we had observed the common conflation between AI algorithms on the one hand and the decision support systems that platform and fuse them. For example, the common confusion between algorithms initially developed for the Pentagon under Project Maven on the one hand and Palantir's Maven Smart System, though of course they are integrated together and used together. These distinctions aren't academic. Accuracy around them serves both investigative and accountability efforts. Now, beyond the original conceptual framework that you heard about from Sophia and real-world military targeting cycles, at the start of this project or thereabouts, we asked ourselves, how can we tell a single story while capturing so many technologies of surveillance and targeting available to advanced militaries? Real-world examples of targeting are often too opaque to outsiders. Some would have seen us bogged down in the specificities of a given conflict, or proven too constrictive, or maybe even distracting. As such, we concluded that only a fictional scenario would serve our purposes, with a story led by a relatable character and in an environment not unfamiliar to the bulk of our readership. And believe me, it was a challenge, the whole team coming up with that scenario. Now, the kill chain begins not in reality with data, but with humans and human activity that are sensed and then rendered into data, now increasingly processed, cleaned, analyzed, and fused by AI. It is then platformed and rendered visible into often gamified decision support systems, like that in our story. As such, our fictional character, 30-year-old Christo Luna, emerges in an environment we know in intelligence investigations as one of ubiquitous technical surveillance. I don't mean highly specialized sensors like satellites or synthetic aperture radar. I don't just mean them, but also the everyday ones we take for granted, our mobile phones, our vehicles, CCTV on the street, and so on. These sensors record, capture, and produce what some have described as a tsunami of data. The application of AI to process, analyze, and fuse that began over 15 years ago, particularly to metadata. Its application to computer vision took a further decade or so. So you'll see in our story that among many examples, we brought one of AI algorithmic link analysis, but dating to the 2010s. That example was the US National Security Agency's misidentification of a journalist as a member of Al-Qaeda, based on his movements and calling patterns. It is important to recognize that many of these algorithms, some of which were exposed by Edward Snowden's revelations, functioned on a junk scientific basis, yet their application continues to this day, not only in war zones, but also in counterinsurgency settings, as well as pre-crime analytics in so-called peacetime nations. Those of us who work on surveillance investigations will know that the practice of device attribution, link analysis, and geolocation is a flawed one, and inherently so, arising from the many variables inherent to those systems. It takes extraordinary time and diligence to be done properly, and even then, doubts remain. Yet those weaknesses have been glossed over in the interests of expedited military targeting. I'll give you an example. One military that you read about in our story uses telecom signal traffic as an estimation of collateral damage for a given strike. but when done en masse and in areas of 2G or 3G signal, location estimations for a handset can span between 500 meters to several kilometers. So if the AI algorithms are processing and visualizing the locations of hundreds of handsets in a given zone, but the scientific basis of that geolocation is junk, the problem is inherent to that data and not just the algorithms that my colleagues will describe in more detail. In other words, when inaccurate data is put in and processed by junk scientific algorithms, bad decisions come out. Shortly, my colleagues will take you through chapter 3 of the story, titled Intelligence and Identification, where they'll describe the tech involved, the problems it poses, and reference established use cases. When Heidi and Sophia pick the story up, an intelligence analyst is already monitoring the subject of our story and identifies them as one Christo Luna. Said analyst, military analyst, then proceeds to assess whether Christo is a threat, with the aid of AI algorithms that feed into their decision support system. So how did Christo end up in this precarious position, to be flagged as a potential threat in a conflict between nations? Our story begins with two neighboring nations at war. On the one hand, Christo's home nation is an advanced military, monitoring a town in the opposing army's territory, from which the army has launched attacks. Through exploitation of space-based sensors, the military's AI algorithms continually scan satellite imagery for new activity and therefore potential threats. This capability is, of course, akin to that of the NGA's Maven, formerly an element of the Pentagon's Project Maven. Among the dozen sites those algorithms have flagged for unusual potential hostile activity is a disused community center. Having been flagged by the algorithm, the community center thus becomes a potential target. Now, the military has placed a virtual boundary on a digital map of the area around the disused building to intensely monitor activity within that space, a practice known as geofencing. Anybody entering the site is tracked. Now, unbeknown to him, 30-year-old Christo enters the geofence, and thus his phone is instantly logged and tracked by the military's algorithms. Christo then sends a message, which is automatically intercepted and then auto-translated by LLMs. Now, I encourage you to go through all chapters to understand how we dissected the stages of the kill chain and the tech involved. But the problem is not just the process, but also the outcome, as our final chapter shows. As my colleagues take you through chapter 3, we want you to keep this in mind. The rush to make more decisions faster than ever rests on a system of overlapping, often flawed algorithms applied to imperfect datasets. It's a march of technology that risks instituting more deadly errors. Now I'll hand over to my colleagues Heidi and Sophia for their walkthrough of chapter 3.
Thanks for that, Namir. As he just mentioned, we're going to really dive into one chapter of the narrative now to give you a sense of how the story unfolds, and really talk through the kinds of technical systems introduced and dissected throughout the narrative. So as Namir mentioned, this is the third chapter. This is called Intelligence and Identification. So at this point, as you can see, the analyst is tasked with identifying the man who has entered this geofenced area that's marked out in the decision support system displayed here. Like most advanced militaries, the imaginary military here is closely surveilling telecommunications in the neighboring country. And its operators, whose perspective we're assuming as we kind of go through this story, can access telecoms data and automatically link numbers to people who own that cell phone. They can also automatically intercept text messages and calls, and all of this data is instantly available. It's displayed on user-friendly interfaces like the one shown here. So in our reconstruction of this process here, you have the operator querying the decision support system and matching the SIM card logged in the area to, as Namir said, Christo, a 30-year-old man. So the task that the operator now has is to understand whether Christo poses an imminent threat to their own forces. And the operator is now relying on a social scoring system to do precisely that. So a social scoring system is combing through data that's passively collected from civilians and combatants alike in this neighboring country. This includes calls, text messages, social media posts and activity, and information from facial recognition cameras and other visual surveillance data. So as we mentioned, no human can possibly parse all of the information that militaries are collecting passively from neighboring countries, from urban spaces, etc. So they often rely on these algorithms called social scoring systems or risk profiling systems to do precisely that. And we break down how that works, and we have definitions for these more technical terms, which we'll be talking through as well. So in this system that we've built, Christo is automatically given a score of a 7, which according to the algorithm the military is using means that he is likely a member of the opposing army. Now, Heidi will discuss this technology in depth, but as we said, we're modeling this system, this social scoring system, off of technology that is in use today by many advanced militaries. These systems are used, as I mentioned, to try to fish out potential combatants from civilian populations, and they have been documented to fail, to not work very precisely, to rest upon a lot of false assumptions and problematic assumptions. One particular system that has been reported on in depth is that we're kind of modeling this off of is one called Lavender, which was used by the Israeli military inside the Gaza Strip. And that system works similarly by taking profiles of known members of the military wing of Hamas or Islamic Jihad and taking certain features from those known members, like the contacts in their phone, location data, where they went every day, who they called, what they said on the phone, and try to use those features as a model. And with that model, they assign scores to every single resident in the Gaza Strip, a score from 1 to 100, and use that to determine whether or not they could possibly be a valid military target, whether or not they were members of the military wing of those militant organizations. And in reporting that's come out about that system, those who've used it have emphasized just how faulty those scores were, how inaccurate many of the technical systems that they relied upon were, and also just the underlying assumption that one can predict members of military organizations through this kind of predictive analysis and through these kinds of social scoring systems. So I'll hand it over now to Heidi, who will talk through more about the technical details of that.
Thanks, Sophia. So for the technologies that are used for things like risk profiling, we wanted to bring attention to the fact that not every AI or machine learning algorithm used by militaries is complex or large scale, like modern models, like large language models. Some of them are actually quite rudimentary in their nature. And this includes the use of decision trees, which is one of the simplest machine learning algorithms there is. So we initially, when we have kind of this yellow text box, we have an overall summary of what the likely machine learning algorithm is used for this type of algorithm. We give a brief description, and then we talk about kind of the overarching issue with it. So in this case, we are talking about risk profiling systems rely on decision trees. And as Nathan kind of hovered over, we kind of have a technical definition for these algorithms. If you are interested in that, if you're not, you can sort of move on. But the idea here is that we say, okay, well, decision trees kind of take data from various sources like telecom providers, social media, to try to detect combatants. But these models often overclassify civilians as combatants themselves. We then go into a technical box, and then we split it into 3 separate sections. We have the technology itself. So in this case, we talk about the risk profiling system, what it means, as well as the machine learning algorithm that's often used for it. there's many different machine learning algorithms that can be used, but we kind of looked at different use cases, like the one Sophia covered, to be like, right, this is the most likely one that was used in this case. In the problem section, we then talk about what's the issue with this type of algorithm. And we either link to investigations or academic papers to try to explain at a high level what those issues are. And so if you're interested or you're technical, you can then go read that paper in more detail. So in this case, we say decision tree modeling can be based on overly simplified characteristics and attributes, and it can rely also on outputs from either error-prone data or AI. And when that's deployed in Warzone, these errors mean that these models can overclassify civilian populations as potential threats. Sophia already covered the use case, but an example of that is we've seen with the IDF is a use of sort of WhatsApp contacts or groups, right? But if you are a militant, you are very likely to be in groups with civilian or people who are not related to the specific conflict at hand. But just through these kind of really basic, simplified characteristics, you can then end up saying, okay, this person who has nothing to do with this militia is in this specific WhatsApp group or is in communication with this specific person, and then overclassify them as such. So this is a theme throughout. As you go through the chapters, we have this text box for every type of sort of system or technology to dissect it further for the reader. If you're not interested, we keep it high level. I'll hand it back to Sophia so we can go through the rest of the narrative.
Thanks, Heidi. Yes. So after the operator gets the score and is using it to determine if this person is a valid military target, they have to verify how the algorithm gave them this information. So militaries using these kinds of systems, militaries like the Israeli military, often say that their operators are not just blindly relying on a social scoring system to determine who or what is a valid military target. They're going through the supporting evidence and seeing if the algorithm has made a valid decision. In our scenario, we also emphasize how often, even if they are verifying this algorithmic output, they're doing so under situations of immense time constraints. Reporting from the Israeli context emphasized that in some cases, operators who were reviewing a score provided by Lavender only had 30 seconds to review an algorithmic output and then pass that target along to the Air Force for an aerial strike. So here we've recreated the kind of time constraints that people within the military often encounter when using algorithmic systems like this. Here, the operator only has 3 minutes to go through, and the clock starts ticking immediately. So to review the supporting evidence, the operator is scrolling through supporting data that's informing Christo's potential status as a member of the opposing army. So the first set of evidence is social media posts. And here, reviewing the evidence doesn't mean going back to raw data. It means reviewing automatically translated pieces of information, posts scraped from something like Facebook or Instagram or Telegram, these kinds of social networking sites, and relying on automated translations of these posts to determine if somebody seems to be within the opposing army. So Heidi will break down the machine learning systems used to process this information, but I want to underscore here how even in cases where militaries say their operators are verifying the kind of supporting the supporting criteria that's used to determine somebody's score in one of these systems, it really just means clicking through data that's already been algorithmically processed. So that's not that's not a kind of adequate human verification of an AI generated output. It's really somebody already going through something that's already been mediated by a machine learning algorithm. And Heidi can talk more about what precisely that means at a technical level and why that might be problematic.
Yeah, I mean, as Sophia was saying, we were just talking about the risk profiling, and sort of some of the data going into that already have been processed through other types of AI algorithm. In this case, we're seeing the use of generative AI and large language models being used to parse, translate, and classify a lot of social media content. Prior to that, it was other types of language models. But as many of you probably are aware, large language models can hallucinate and fabricate outputs and often fail to account for nuance or specifically synthetic information intended to manipulate these models. So if we open up the detailed description here, What we're trying to get across, besides hallucination, is that LLMs are built and trained on open internet data, right? Which means that they're prone to things like what we call data web poisoning attacks, which are intended to manipulate models and compromise their behavior, especially if they're used for military applications. And in the detailed box, we actually cite a Wired investigation to demonstrate how Russia has been compromising online information to influence large language model outputs, which is particularly relevant when considering how Ukraine's intelligence gathering often uses Russian social media sites and messaging groups. And, even back in 2021, the US Army already found that things like event barraging, misinformation campaigns, trend hijacking, and military deception will ultimately kind of detract from the usefulness of open source intelligence, which unfortunately a lot of that is fed to LLMs in different operations. And ultimately this makes a reliance on things like large language models to build up profiles of targets particularly risky if you consider that this is a technology that's not only prone to hallucination but prone to manipulation as well. What does that mean when militaries are then using that to select targets? Back to you, Sophia.
Thanks. Yeah, so moving on through this verification process, the next set of evidence that determined the score that the operator has to verify is link analysis. In other words, an algorithm has analyzed Christo's social network by pulling information from a range of sources. So who Christo might follow on Instagram or Facebook, who they message on these social media sites, who's in their WhatsApp contacts, and who they talk to most regularly, and other groups they might belong to on other encrypted applications like Telegram channels and the like. So these algorithms that are used to perform link analysis are very common, and they've long been used by militaries to help with targeting, with identifying potential combatants. Most notably, the US has used these kinds of algorithms throughout its operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and in counterterrorism operations in Pakistan going back to the 2000s. And there's been excellent investigative reporting about kind of the faulty assumptions that go into the use of these technologies. So Heidi, again, will talk through some of the details in terms of these algorithms at the technical level.
So again, as Sophia was saying, they're using kind of more rudimentary AI here. In this case, random forests, which is a subtype of decision trees, which we talked about earlier, right? It's not just LLMs, other types of machine learning algorithm. I won't bore you with the details of what a random forest is and why that's different, but if we open up the technical box, I think it's really important to focus on the problem with it here. So essentially, their entire purpose is to identify patterns for specific classifications, like a combatant. But random forests actually produce a lot of false positives, which means that they have sort of poor and unreliable performance. And when you apply that to identify combatants, random forests often mark an individual like a journalist or a humanitarian worker who may have similar movement like a militant as a combatant themselves, simply because they kind of share a set of category. And the use case we wanted to bring up here actually is one by the US government called the Skynet surveillance program, which was used in Pakistan and relied on algorithms to identify suspected militants. And we actually already have, reports from that period which showed that they misidentified specific individual, in this case, Ahmed Zaidan, which is a journalist who had contact with members of Al-Qaeda and Taliban for reporting purposes. So again, showing that these categories or like the classification that these models, are often trained on tend to sort of overgeneralize to, a whole other set of individuals who are not combatants or militants. Back to you, Sophia.
Great. Yeah, so the last piece of corroborating information that our operator has to go through is location data that's pulled from hacked CCTV cameras across the city that Christo lives in. So Christo is marked out by the system because he's seen to travel near major military bases 3 times in recent weeks. And based on this location data, he's again identified as a potential combatant. And so once again, we're modeling this after what militaries are doing right now with very current technology. Militaries have been using facial recognition algorithms to track movement automatically in various contexts for years. And this includes accessing cameras covering urban spaces, cameras that they're hacking into in foreign cities, cameras positioned around military installations. It can also include automatically tracking license plates on cars, and also using other visual intelligence to do so, to monitor people and identify them in real time. One system that we cite in the Tech Explainer is one called Blue Wolf and Red Wolf, which is a facial recognition system that the Israeli military has used for the better part of the last 8 years to automatically identify Palestinians across the West Bank, as well as those who are going through major checkpoints leading from the occupied Palestinian territories into Israel proper. It's part of a broader facial recognition surveillance program that the military has. And it allows them to automatically track people's movements and again flag people whose location data and movement patterns they deem to be suspicious according to certain criteria. So I'll leave it once again to Heidi to discuss the technology.
Thanks, Sophia. And this is going to be the last technical piece before I bore you all to death about it. But this is actually quite a crucial one throughout the piece, and not just in chapter 3. We talk about computer vision systems. This is almost in some sense central to so many different types of systems and algorithms used. So computer vision system and object detection systems are used for different purposes. In this case, we're talking about it for facial recognition, but the issues with them are the same across the board. They're typically built on what we call convolutional neural network. It is a type of neural network that has been highly specialized for sort of image detection, object and recognition, except they are incredibly brittle and faulty for a lot of reasons. They don't function well in different variations of lighting. If there's new unexpected like weather conditions, they would not be able to sort of cope with that they haven't seen before. For example, if it's raining and sort of the rain hits a sensor of the specific image, that's it. It will no longer operate as intended. If you're using it for something like facial recognition, you have things like facial obstruction. You also have issues with image resolutions that can degrade with network connectivity, as an example. So these systems are especially prone to false positives and even false negatives because they try to infer identity from partial or unreliable visual similarities, like clothing, color, body shape, or gait. And a person may be flagged as a suspected combatant simply because they appear to be near known targets. They may look like they're carrying a weapon when they're carrying, a bicycle. And we've seen examples of this over and over again. So I just want to mention that you're probably going to see multiple mentions of convolutional neural networks. And we talk about them in different contexts, although in this specific case, they're quite faulty specifically for facial recognition.
Great. Yes. So thanks for keeping with us as we kind of break down precisely the different machine learning algorithms that are integrated into this specific chapter. I think it's important to do so because you can see precisely where these systems don't work, and also how militaries are just moving ahead with relying on them anyway, and how difficult it is for human operators to both understand these limitations and also act according to that understanding of their limitations and not follow automatically, the recommendation of a machine learning system. Unfortunately, that's not what happens in our scenario. The operator here confirms what the social scoring system has suggested, and confirms that Christo is in fact a combatant and moves forward with proceeding with the attack. And you'll have to read on to really understand what happens next. But the issue we really want to emphasize and to illustrate here is precisely how militaries often point to the fact that a human is reviewing these AI-generated outputs, that they're intervening in them, that they're in control of these situations, they're in the loop, they're on the loop. There's various terminology militaries are using. But in this case, even when the operator is cross-checking the initial score, they're doing so and using information that has already been processed, translated, analyzed by another set of machine learning algorithms. And it doesn't mean that they're capable of correcting all of these errors and any of the issues we've outlined. So it's really quite difficult for humans to intervene in machine learning outputs. We've also emphasized here the problem of automation bias and underscored how, with the time constraints of active combat, especially how easy it is for human operators to defer to algorithmic outputs instead of exercising, as we define it here, their own discretion or judgment. It's something that is obviously not just unique to military contexts. I think we all know what automation bias might be like in various contexts with machine learning and AI infiltrating many other aspects of life. But in the military context, simply deferring to a machine learning output is really a question of life or death. And we're trying to illustrate how it happens and what it means here. So yes, I'll leave it to Joe, I believe, now.
Hi, everyone. Yes, thank you to Sophia and Heidi. I even having spent so much time working on this project with them, I still learn every time I hear them talk. So it's really great. So I'm just here to moderate and send the questions through. We've got only a few more minutes. I guess we can run slightly over, but I'm trying to end it shortly after 5. I'm just going to pick a couple, and they're not specified who they're going to answer for, but I think I'll pick who I think is best placed. I think Axel Charles has asked, how do you determine the type of algorithm that is used? Like for lavender, did you determine a high likelihood that it's a decision tree algorithm? I can't even say it. How did you reach that assessment? I mean, I think we all know who we're firing that one to. Heidi, yeah, you can. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a mixture of things. Some we already knew, like for Skynet, which I just talked about. There was investigation that revealed that it was random forest, like, journalists who had access to specific information. So that made it easy. For the other ones, it was actually a mixture of understanding just what the input and output is, right? And so typically machine learning algorithms prior to large language models or generative AI used to be very like fit for purpose, right? So if it's images, it's going to be a convolutional neural network, right? If you're looking at things like trying to guide a drone, for terminal guidance, it's likely going to be something like more recurrent. We also explore other types like autoencoders and so on. You can actually use multiple different machine learning algorithms for the same task. So we went with kind of what was most likely it was used for in the literature. There's also literature that comes out of like the US military, of academic papers from like the US Navy, from different militaries as well. And that gives us a sense of, right, they were using autoencoders for this things or recurrent neural networks for that thing. So it took, I think this is actually a really good question because it's worth mentioning that there's many different ways and orders and how these algorithms can be used. There actually isn't a standard implementation of a decision support system. So what we're just trying to do here is, as Namir was talking about earlier, we try to cover the bases of it all, give a variety. It doesn't mean it replicates one exactly, but it's most likely kind of the algorithm that was used. Either it was verified or based on the literature. I hope that answers your question.
Perfect. Okay, and there's 2 questions here on a similar theme, which is Sarah Wilbanks has asked about how should we think about safeguards and regulating, given the fallacy of meaningful human control. And then Anna has asked a similar question, which is, while knowing the problems and holes within current systems is helpful, I can imagine proponents would argue that these are essentially teething problems. I guess I'm going to send this one to Sophia, maybe. How can your work be used to advocate for regulation and prohibition of such systems instead?
Thanks, Joe. That's a great question, and it's an important one to think about. The overarching kind of message that I think comes across going through this, although I'm happy to hear other perspectives and as you all go through it, is not that these are kind of teething problems that will just be ironed out as these technologies are developed and refined. Actually, what's so useful about really breaking down precisely how these machine learning algorithms work is really emphasizing the inherent limitations in the actual technical infrastructure. So this isn't a problem of just something that needs to be piloted and refined by real world testing. It's a problem with the actual underlying algorithms that are scaffolding the software and that are being integrated into various aspects of the kill chain. So I think that kind of close analysis of how the technology actually works could be really integral to various advocacy campaigns surrounding the harms and limitations of automated warfare, the ethical drawbacks, and problems that arise as militaries offload this kind of decision making to flawed technologies. And other kinds of initiatives that various organizations are spearheading towards, outright banning fully autonomous weapons and the like. I think as we said, there's a lot of hype and mystique that surrounds how these technologies actually work. And a lot of that is to the benefit of private companies that are making a lot of money by making quite grandiose claims about just how lethal and just how efficient these systems are. And what we're trying to do is show precisely how they don't work. And this is based not on, theoretical literature only, but also reporting and research with people who have used these systems, attention to real world effects and case studies as they're being deployed today. I wonder if maybe Namir or anybody else wants to add on to that answer.
Pretty comprehensive, Sophia. Thank you.
Yeah, we're just going to do a couple more because there's lots of questions now. But Samuel Perlo Freeman has asked, maybe this is one for Namir, in talking about the faults and limitations of the AI kill chain, to what extent should we frame cases such as the one presented in the project as tragic errors, and to what extent they reflect the design intent of the top political and military decision makers? And I think there's a similar kind of question, interesting question from Edin about you in a way that so that there's such a need for much more exposure and understanding this. I have a question around technical aspects. To what extent does focusing on flawed AI errors obscure the intent of that military? In this case, he said genocidal intent of that military and gospel. So those kind of two questions really here, I guess, are about intent and also whether there's an element of this focusing on this can help us can almost absolve the militaries of responsibility to a certain extent. I'm going to throw that one to Namir.
Thank you. Well, certainly in this project, you can see once you go through the visual journalism that it's so incredibly jam-packed with examples, scenarios, analysis, explanations. We even had to keep a glossary separate because it was already replete with information. So certainly in the Airwars AI Now project, there's only so much we could cover. And believe me, we had much more to say than what you can see on in the visual journalism. Now, an analysis of the problems in tech, cascading errors, and so on and so forth doesn't preclude a separate conversation around intent. And the two can be combined, of course. And I think, obviously, when you're considering some of the AIs that are used in Gaza and the use of telecom signals for collateral damage estimates, the example that I gave you, it's important also to go to the heart of that technology to understand that it's so deeply flawed that I personally would argue that it shouldn't be used in any scenario, given the example that I gave you, that a handset would be geolocated within an estimated accuracy of 600 meters to a few kilometers, depending on the network generation that's being used. Sort of speaking on as an independent researcher, my opinion is that I do think there are times in the tech and war journalism we do forget that while these systems are operating at breakneck speeds and presenting decisions and scenarios at those breakneck speeds, people, while, say, for example, a military analyst or a targeteer may have 30 seconds to make a decision, they still have the agency to reject that. Aside from obviously the political and other pressures that they may face. So there are still humans in that process. And if a military decides to operate a particular system at the speed of light in a given scenario and to strike or to aim to strike 1,000 targets a day, then that is also a decision about what it deems to be acceptable civilian casualties or potential civilian casualties as well. So I think that conversation should definitely not be forgotten, the human agency one, and sit alongside tech explainers like the one that my colleagues and I have attempted to achieve in this visual project.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we'll just do one last round of questions. I think probably to Sophia, because there's quite a few on Israel Palestine is the person that's worked on it the most. Andrew has asked, in your research, did you find any examples outside of the use of Palestine Israel? Yes, I'll just answer that one. Yes, if you read the tech explainers, you've mentioned Kashmir and the Uyghur communities. No, this is primarily a military conflicts we're looking at. So primarily you're looking at Ukraine, Iran, Gaza, but also others. Like, we're not looking at mass surveillance. Namir has done lots of work on mass surveillance in the past. Like, that was and again, I don't know the Kashmir, obviously, I don't think is as well documented in terms of the technologies being used. So primarily the ones that I think we know the most about are those three, and there's a couple of others. And also some in Latin America. But if you read through the tech boxes, each of them kind of has 3 or 4 examples, or where possible. And then Roger Thompson asked a really good question, which is one that the military will often say, which is, I'll throw this one to Sophia as well, which is, how do you respond to the claim that deep limitations with this process nonetheless yield fewer non-combatant casualties than human-only approaches? Which is, I think, a regular point that militaries make, which is, okay, these might be flawed systems, but the other systems were not perfect. So Sophia, and then I'll just quickly throw another one at you, which is Kaylin Goodluck has asked, how do we understand that the use of lavender and where's daddy overlapped in the context of specifically Israel? So in the terms of killing of journalists by Israel, approximately half of journalists killed in Gaza were killed in their homes. How do we understand, how close can we attribute these airstrike killing of journalists in their homes to the system, since we can only assess these patterns?
Great. Thanks for those questions. So the first one was about how do we respond to military saying that these actually help lower civilian casualties when they're deployed. I guess you would answer in 2 ways. I think this relates also to what Namir was saying in the question about how much can we actually blame the technology and how much is it actually a question of political decision making, both within the military and within, the political echelon of ministers and people within the government waging war. And I think I would say a few things to that. The first is what I think is so helpful about this website and the experience of going through it is you actually see how these systems, make the act of targeting and killing into something that's both quite user-friendly, quite seamless, and can happen really, really quickly, thanks to the set of machine learning algorithms that are culling through data, analyzing it, parsing it, and then churning out targets really, really rapidly. It's no coincidence that as militaries say we're entering into this new era of AI-assisted warfare, the pace of targeting and killing in terms of air wars has been unprecedented. So that was in Gaza after October 7th, 2023. The Israeli military was striking twice every 1 minute, a pace of bombing that was only rivaled in the joint US-Israeli air war that erupted in Iran this winter. So I think that I want to emphasize there that it's not just about, how perfect these technologies work in kind of isolated use cases, like what we've emphasized here, but also how they speed up the pace and process of generating targets, of validating targets, and allow human operators to sign off on targets and sign off on killing at a faster rate, and at a rate that is quite distanced from, you know, the effects on the ground. And that's, I'm not just saying that based on kind of like a conjecture that I'm making. There's been reporting and research about how this has transformed just the act of killing in war. So I would emphasize that, and emphasize the military's own kind of embrace of speed and scale and volume in thinking about civilian casualties. I would also say that the embrace of these systems has changed the actual policies that militaries adapt in warfare. After October 7th, the Israeli military raised the number of civilian non-combatants that could be killed in an airstrike to 20 for low-ranking members of Hamas or Islamic Jihad. And that was a decision that was made to expedite the pace of bombing. So again, the embrace of AI, the desire to ramp up air wars according to a specific rate and at a specific speed and scale comes with these political decisions that allow killing to unfold, and has a really detrimental effect on civilians. And we can kind of think about how that's unfolded in Iran as well. So that's what I would say to that question. The second question, Joe, was, can you remind me? Sorry, I've lost track.
Yes, it was about rate of journalists killed in Gaza and the conflation between Lavender and Where's Daddy, for example.
Oh, yeah, I mean that's a specific question about these specific AI systems. I would say that in the story we kind of talk through those particular use cases in I think a helpful way. Something about risk profiling system and social scoring systems that take kind of generic characteristics from those who are thought to be militants and try to guess who fits those characteristics makes it quite easy. Heidi talked about this example of a journalist that was killed in Pakistan years ago by the US military. It makes it quite easy to target people who fit those characteristics. And, you know, there's been more reporting about Israel's own targeting protocols and the targeting of journalists. But I would just say that these systems give a kind of veneer of technical efficiency to campaigns that have caused immense destruction and killed many, many civilians and journalists and humanitarian workers. And so we can think through the role of technology in kind of legitimating those military tactics, or what role it might play there. But yes, within the piece, there's a breakdown of how those systems work in those particular contexts as well.
If it's all right, I just want to add to that real quick on the accountability bit. One, I want to plug in an Air Wars piece. I wasn't part of that, but the rest of the Air Wars teams were. In that the US military themselves admitted that they weren't necessarily keeping track of when AI decisions were being made or not. And I think that speaks a lot for how they might use these types of technology to sort of launder sort of their accountability. But second, something that I hear a lot as a technical person is that AI will, in fact, enable sort of IHL because it's better at logging, or you can track things more specific. You'll have more evidence from like a technical perspective. But despite that being a selling point that we're constantly seeing these AI companies saying, in reality, it's very much a black box, and we are not seeing the militaries who are deploying these types of systems do that logging that's often being advertised. So I just wanted to just quickly jump in to talk about the accountability piece there. And it's not the case that it does in fact make these systems more accountable, as we often hear in some of the talking points of these AI companies.
Okay. Well, unless there's anyone else, I know that we're running a little bit over. We're running 10 minutes late, so I just wanted to thank everybody for coming. Please do go and read the piece. We're like open to hearing feedback. And this will be published online in due course. Both Airwars and AI Now are happy to hear feedback. I found as somebody that was more involved in the narrative side, the tech parts that Heidi and Sophia worked on, like really helped me understand, when you hear about Lavender and these systems, to understand how they work. So I think it really is worth you like taking, hopefully it's worth you taking time to sit through the piece again and really digest it. And yeah, anything else, anyone else? Otherwise, we'll say thank you very much for everyone for joining.